Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to the first Bertha Centre Brown Bag for 2022. We're really happy you could join us today. We've got an exciting presentation for you and hopefully a lively discussion thereafter. My name is Ntombini Marangani, and I'm the Senior Manager at the Bertha Centre. And today we're being joined by Dr. Simon Sizwe Mayson, who will speak to us about his research on changemakers enabling transformative social innovation through an intermediary organization focusing on the Global South. Just by way of background, the Bertha Centre Brown Bag series was launched last year to create a regular forum for discussion around ideas of systems thinking, innovation, and social justice. We hold this forum every 2 months. Our inaugural seminar was held last year in December, and our next one will be in early April. Just to let you know about logistics, this session is recorded and will be made available on YouTube shortly after we complete this afternoon. And we ask that as you have questions during this very interesting webinar, that you drop them in the chat. We'll assemble them and then ask them one by one to Simon after he's completed delivering his entire presentation. And if you're having any difficulty hearing or seeing, please just also drop that in the chat so we can address that as the seminar goes on. So I'd like to just briefly introduce Simon now. He is currently the new program lead for the Small Towns and Regeneration Learning and Support Program at the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership. Before joining that outfit, he was an independent consultant, and his work history has included time with the City Manager's Office in the City of Johannesburg, working with UN Habitat and South African Cities Network. He holds a PhD from WITS. And as I said, today he'll talk to us about his action research on changemakers and transformative social innovation. And I'll now hand it over to you, Simon.
Thanks so much, Ntombini. Yeah, so I actually just started in my new role, which is why the square brackets are there around it. And so that's one of the programs I'm leading, and I'm yet to find out which other programs I'm going to be leading. But hopefully the work that I'm talking about today will also be informing what I'm doing at EDP. And I've left my email address at the end of the presentation as well. I'd love to hear from you if you have anything to chat about, either in the presentation or otherwise. Cool. So this was actually my PhD. And I did my PhD in the form of action research, almost as an excuse to have a chance to explore what I wanted to explore. And most of that was around new economies. And so I was finding that although as individuals, we're striving for a good life, and for many people, a good life is pretty clear what we want as individuals. Collectively, what that means is that we're creating a future that no one wants. When you take the agglomeration of what all of us are striving for at individual level, at a collective level, the consequences are pretty dire. And the current economic system is generally recognized as not working for most people, for future generations, nor for the non-human species or the environment. And these are the authors, Hickel, Jackson, Rayworth. They're some key alternative or new economies authors I would really recommend people have a look at if they're interested in things like donor economics or degrowth, less is more, prosperity, real understandings of what prosperity is. So I was looking for alternatives, but not just theoretical alternatives. What are the tangible changes that can actually be achieved given the current economic system? And as Schmidt says, the literature often remains inchoate as to the practicalities of social change and its actual realization. Often it remains theoretical, especially in these new economies discussions. And so that brought on action research. What is achievable in the here and now? So, and apologies, just a little aside. I was trained out of aesthetically pleasing presentations because academics, including my supervisor, were saying focus on the content. So very boring looking, but please, I hope that it's interesting in terms of the content of it. And luckily at EDP, there are people that can do amazing presentations for me, so I don't have to worry. So the stages of action research, very briefly, it's plan, act, observe, reflect, and repeat. It's things like designing the plane while flying it, learning by doing, ebb and flow. And if people are involved in social enterprise and social innovation, I'm sure you are familiar with these processes in setting up businesses or enterprises, and the organic nature that it has to take place. So action research actually suits that very well. What I was most excited about is that it allows for direct involvement of the researcher. And the PhD, as I said earlier, provided the time and also the funding. I was funded by NRF and also by Wits School of Governance. And that allowed me time to experiment without having to take project funding money from whatever funds I managed to raise during the process for the action. And my research aim was essentially to enable diverse change makers towards a well-being economy, which means, in short, people and planet are prioritized over profit. Not to say that profit cannot happen at all, but that first and foremost, it is people and planet. So one of the core concepts, which is actually very convoluted as a conceptual framework and also not very well defined in the academic literature, it's change makers and change making. So interestingly enough, halfway through the process, while I was already very familiar with the term and using the term myself, change makers, I came across my grandfather's work. I'm not that old. I wasn't writing in 1976, but my grandfather, Cedric Mayson, was, and he was writing about change makers back in 1976, far before things like Ashoka got founded in 85. It's quite interesting that this term was coming about then. And what he said about a change maker, it's people that say something ought to be done about it, not the people. Oh, sorry. While some say something ought to be done about it, others do something. And it's the latter that those doers, those are the actual change makers. A more academic definition that I used for my own work was an act of change making is that which has the potential for transformative social innovation, which basically means changes in social relations that challenge, alter, or replace dominant systems, for instance, towards new economic systems. And some other authors refer to it as transformative agency. A core part of this understanding is that agency is inherently collective. It's never an individual working alone. A change maker is never working alone. This is obviously common sense, but often change makers are celebrated as these kind of lone rangers, and yet they're always in interaction with others. By nature, no systemic change can happen without interaction with other people. And interestingly, existing systems can enable individual actors. So some people are more enabled simply by the system that they find themselves in, and vice versa. Enabled agents can transform systems that enabled them. So just what happened actually? So that's a little bit of the background theory. So what did happen through the action research period? I'll just kind of show you. I mean, there's quite a lot of interest in the media, especially around COVID, and that's when a lot of media was picking up on positive stories. I'll just give a little highlight. You can also Google Makers Valley if you get bored of listening to me, and that's our website, makersvalley.org.za. Or if you want to look at the social media, what's going on now, it's at makersvalley.josie. Or Josie, and you can look at that now if you feel like it. So how did these things happen? And I will describe what happened more a little bit later, but first I'll give you some more understanding of how it happened. So really what I found it came down to is this concept of hybrid infrastructures. And I'll go into that now. Hybridity is a core component of change making, I found, but particularly the form of change making that we took with Makers Valley Partnership. So it often relies on hybridity in form and in practice, where there's this far-sighted vision, a vision that's often a little more radical, but a real pragmatism to realize any action in the interim. And quite often that pragmatism, if it's not there, then no action is realized. And that's where you get a lot of academics writing about how things should be, but with no translation into the practicalities of how they actually could happen in the immediate term. And therefore, often just, the texts are lost, or beautiful blue sky thinking around how things should be, but it's impossible to implement it. And social enterprises find themselves in this position often where they're balancing a kind of common good orientation and their deeper purpose, their raison d'etre for the enterprise, which is that long-term vision, but have very pressing financial sustainability needs and have to generate an income, and often have to de-radicalize quite a lot. So that compromise to ensure that transformation is achieved at a smaller scale, rather than awaiting change at a regime level, if you're familiar with systems analysis, for instance, with the national economic system, that really relied, in the case of my action research, on hybrid infrastructures, and these are entities and practices that enable transformation within the broader system. So both the habits and the practices and the rhythms, as well as the entities or institutions that enable that. So yeah, it was a lot about a strategy around hybridity, which accepts the ethical challenges of pragmatism in the hope that it contributes to building a more just future. And those ethical challenges were quite vexing at times, both personally and for the organization that we started. A little bit of background on what an intermediary organization is. I mean, it was in the title of this presentation. So intermediary organizations in many cases are those that develop and manage these hybrid infrastructures, where tangible change can take place. They're also known sometimes as backbone organizations, and they lie between sectors, connecting government, market, and community, identify synergies and leverage points in line with a common vision. And they're facilitators of an innovation niche creation. So Haman, actually, I'm sure many of you are familiar, if you are joining from Bertha, is at GSB and very involved in the world of social innovation. And they actually researched, one of their case studies in this 2013 paper was Cape Town Partnership, it was actually founded by a current head of EDP that I'm currently working with, and they were looking at this, how intermediary organizations enable this innovation niche, and that's exactly really what Makers Valley Partnership ended up doing. Although we were feeling our way and were not exposed to any of the literature or the how-to guides on how to do it, that's organically what happened. So a little bit about the location and context. We were working primarily in the eastern neighborhoods of inner city Johannesburg. If people aren't familiar with the place, there's been significant deterioration of the built environment. Crime is rife, violent crime, poverty, and at the same time, that kind of contrasts with a limited number of higher-end gated developments and some very large buildings. For instance, Victoria Yards, Ellis House, the Maboneng developments, also in a very similar area, but that also had some quite radical changes over the time that I was working there. And Makers Valley was the term that we came up with for this set of neighborhoods. How we did it was we held a series of collaborative visioning workshops and also creative placemaking activities with existing residents and with the new stakeholders, the developers and other people that were playing more of a powerful role in the area because of the financial weight that they held. So how we worked as Makers Valley Partnership is I joined an emerging local collective in 2018. It wasn't called anything then. And it was just a bunch of creatives, mostly creative businesses, running creative enterprises. And that over a period of 2018 to 2020 evolved into Makers Valley Partnership, which it was really kind of a shifting, nebulous community of people rather than an organization for most of that time. And MVP took on different formulations over the research cycles. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. So even after we formally registered as a nonprofit company, NPO status and PBO status, it still takes on different forms depending on the project that we're working on and who we're roping in. And it became both an informal network in the form of MVP, so MVP partnership, and an organization capable of operation. So it has MVP team, which is a group of 10 people who are made up partly by Yes for Youth interns and a CEO and very capable managers, including of the space. And they kind of are that backbone of this much broader community, which is MV Partnership. And that partnership involves a lot of creative and social enterprises, mostly based in the area. And the aim was to kind of connect these people and organizations to realize a well-being economy through that network, and to support the enablement of new organizations as well. So we started with a stakeholder mapping and built that into quite a strong vision building process with the help of Claire at WITS, which they do a lot of monitoring and evaluation, but also theory of change building. So, and we did door-to-door street interview processes and a bunch of workshop processes, including that theory of change development process, which was a set of 3 workshops and other consultations. But what we found really was that the action built community more than anything else. So the visioning workshops, the chat, the discussions, the what ifs, that was great, but what really built those social relations and cement and grew that bridging capital, this strengthened capital, social capital between people that were had relatively little access to resources and those that had immense access to resources. It was working on projects together. And these projects started with something in partnership with the JDA, the Johannesburg Development Agency, with that creatives collective I mentioned, when turned into Makers Valley Collective. You can just see as the wheel goes round. In US Consulate project, creative placemaking, we had some funding then from British Council with developing inclusive creative economies, the DICE program. Engineers Without Borders came on. Then we had a COVID-19 response, and that's really saw a lot of the fruits of our labor in this what we call the network of possibility that developed. And at the same time, there was a co-working initiative where that co-working space that we have as a hub, I've got some pictures later, started just very informally as a small space that was run as a social enterprise itself, developed a little further when we were able to get more equipment in as a maker space, and then went to what it is currently as Makers Valley Studio. And that's funded by the US Consulate quite generously. And the co-living aspect, also a series of iterations there. The idea was that we connect the living with the working, and that forms a solid base for community members to stay and to work, and thus able to grow that sense of community and the well-being economy. It worked until COVID, and then a lot of people moved. The co-working space totally shut down. We were having a festival that was supposed to really celebrate and catalyze further action, and that obviously didn't happen. But there were a bunch of other projects as well, and some of them are mentioned here: mini libraries, early childhood development training, street carnivals, etc., edible streets. And so the connection, the community really formed around this common vision, but it was quite an intentional formation, and it was structured. That structuring and that formation was facilitated by MVP. And one of my interviewees said that, MVP, Makers Valley Partnership, ensures values establishment and maintenance. We built connections between local change makers and wealthier people in Joburg and globally, and mobilize social and financial capital, enable change makers through an increase in agency through enhanced access to knowledge and resources. That's what I saw as an enablement process. And channeled that kind of individual siloed changemaker agency into something that's more programmatic, sustainable, and built institutional capacity beyond individuals. So that was the registration of MVP as an organization and several other organizations that were incubated through the processes. So yeah, again, Haman and April, I put forward that intermediary organizations should be responsible for developing the shared vision, but then also they ensure that action in support of achieving the vision can actually take place. Quite often visions are left as great to look at on paper, sometimes sent to funders, but the activities are not necessarily linked to the vision and sometimes die away if there isn't a concerted effort to ensure that that vision remains alive. So that intermediary organization is really key to operate as an actual organization rather than just an agreement or partnership between organizations, but to have that backbone organization as well. And nevertheless, partnership is the ultimate postmodern organization characterized by fluidity, uncertainty, ambiguity, and discontinuity. And even in what we found with MVP is that many partnerships were voluntary and informal. Like I said, it was very nebulous. And a lot of the work that was done was pro bono work. And so when the interest dies, so does the project sometimes. What we tried to do as MVP is bridge informal and we relied on two big sister NPOs, nonprofits. So and a company that did a lot of the execution, a local creative enterprise. And in earlier cycles of action research, these were incredibly helpful. So one was Johannesburg Inner City Partnership, and the other was the CDP Curriculum Development Project. And really what happened there was they were able to do all of the formal representing of MVP in contracting, the financial management. They already had a rapport, and so donors could give comfortably. We could receive donations from private donors, and we could ensure that the accountability was there of ensuring that the deliverables were met as per our agreements, which would not have been able to happen if we were just this loose collective. And we as MVP were then able to offer that in turn and basically pay it forward to smaller organizations that were our partners. And once we became formally registered and set up as an organization, we have now taken that role on for the smaller organizations. Yeah, so I think I've talked all about that. So for instance, People's Pantry is one such organization, which I'll show you a little bit about later. We also navigated the bureaucracy of government. So for instance, there was a park upgrade that was budgeted for by the Johannesburg Development Agency, but struggled in procurement processes, government procurement processes. It's very difficult to actually hire local suppliers or to contract with local suppliers. And so they were able to contract with GICP and also with Makers Valley Partnership, and in turn we were able to hire those local suppliers, and that was incredibly beneficial because that local employment generation aspect really was able to be tangibly realized. So Makers Valley Studio is, as I said, the latest operation or the latest iteration of co-working and community, of this co-working space. And it for much of these co-working spaces' lives, it relied on hybridity and their financial models as well. So we didn't have fees. We generated income through we made ourselves allowed to be sustainable through a bartering system. People, for instance, bartered their time, whether it was cleaning or managing or painting the space to upgrade it. Often people donated things, furniture and otherwise. And then we started charging income-based kind of commission, where members of the space, makers within the space, through a kind of honesty box system, gave us a proportion of whatever they made from Sunday markets that were happening at Victoria Yards, which is the larger development we're located in. And over the month of whatever sales they made, they would say, look, this is around about 10% of what we made over the month. And this really relied on trust. It relied on those relationships, and it relied on the fact that we were relatively small, and that you could get a sense of people. We gave significantly discounted rent, where people also said, this is how much I can afford. And we agreed to that at the beginning, and that was kind of reviewed if it looked like people were becoming more successful. There were some free rider issues with people not being totally honest or not following through with the what they'd promised to do in terms of cleaning or otherwise. But with the solid manager, we were actually able to overcome that. And the manager, it ran as a social enterprise, which meant that the manager actually took their own income based on what the income of the space was. So it was in their interest for people to be giving as much as they could, but not overcharging so that they left. It became this, the co-working space was the formal meeting space and the MVP team hub. And it was in the office, it was very useful for there to be a base to a central spot where partners could meet, where the organization could exist. But also for that to be a flexible space with many people coming in and out, rather than a dedicated office to one organization. And it facilitated the spread of alternative practices. For instance, we were able to institute basic things like recycling, executed by a local social enterprise, one of our partners, a swap shop, local employment in the space, and many learning by doing practices, which we're able to kind of look at how a well-being economy could operate at a micro scale. And Schmidt also found that in Germany with similar co-working spaces, that you were able to have these communities develop out of them. And so this community developed sort of hubbed there as quite a diverse makers and change makers group, and that bridging social capital. But we did struggle to retain higher income earners. We did find that, for various reasons, that people are not used to integrating in many cases with different socioeconomic groups, and where there's a lot of diverse. If we're trying to charge similar amounts to co-working spaces elsewhere in wealthier areas, because people should be paying what they proportionally can afford, then they do seem to end up going to the other spaces. This is just a few photos. So there's the MVP team, Makers Valley Studio in the background. That's the launch, and it's now financially sustainable thanks to grant funding. We've changed the model quite significantly. It's no longer a social enterprise because of that partnership with the US Consulate. This is another space that we enabled in Victoria Yards. It's used alternatively as a classroom, as a meeting space, sometimes for corporate events, although there haven't been any of those since COVID. Here's some creative placemaking that was happening, small scale stuff around the neighborhood. The park upgrade with local enterprises. Some community kitchens that started there were 8 community kitchens that started during COVID and are still running, supported by the People's Pantry as a food hub. This is the People's Pantry. If you want to have a look, it's thepeoplespantry.org.za. So it really relied on hybridity, and in Victoria Yards was a core part of the success. However, for Victoria Yards, and we had this mutually beneficial partnership with this large property development. We supported Victoria Yards' image, which they wanted to be seen as socially conscious and supporting the local community, and to ensure that they authentically were We helped them get prizes, some additional resources, and free labor. But they in turn provided us with free or near free space for the co-working space, some services, and that tangible heart to the Makers Valley work, as well as many networks of people that they were connected to. But it was a for-profit development, and some tensions arose. Basic things like there was never a lease agreement permissible between the space because they didn't want to sign off on it. And for instance, the COVID-19 response that we had started up was frequently shifted depending on available space. There were security issues, which is quite exclusionary towards children that use the space. That as part of our after-school programs, or Timbuktu in the Valley's after-school programs. And sometimes we struggled because our name became synonymous with that of Victoria Yards, as found by an independent researcher. And Victoria Yards didn't always have a positive reputation, partly because of the exclusionary policies with local residents and local creatives who didn't feel that they could access that's the space that had been created there. Our biggest concern was gentrification, but I'll return to that a little bit more later. And essentially, my biggest concern was that there was this de-radicalization, I don't think I've ever said that out loud, de-radicalization of MVP's wellbeing economy vision, where Victoria Yards shareholders, they were very keen on the concept of change making and of doing good in the community, but essentially they were coming from a kind of community development angle, which is really maintenance of the current system, more around sort of food parcels and otherwise, and some innovation, but versus kind of a real new economic system, or a desire for a well-being economy, a new economic system to come into place. So sometimes, yeah, we were concerned that there may be too much compromise in this hybrid infrastructure in order to enable the action. So although it's very difficult, so thankfully the surrounding built environment is mostly low-rise residential, and so it's hard to buy up large buildings and convert them into higher-end accommodation or otherwise. So wide-scale gentrification is unlikely, but it is concerning to wonder if, for instance, our placemaking, our creative placemaking initiatives, our park upgrades, do they lend to higher? Do they really cause higher property prices and therefore displacement, or do they genuinely improve life for residents? And the specifics and authenticity of initiatives really just relied on my and other changemakers' personal ethics, because in South Africa, as I'm sure you're aware, there isn't something like a B Corp. There's no legislated social enterprise model or legal entity, and so in the end, it does rely on how we honestly execute or conduct business. And even so, everyday decision making is very difficult and relies a lot on self-awareness and honesty when separating out personal profit incentives and financial sustainability of an initiative. How much income can I take from rental proceeds for an entity than people that are much poorer than me? Where our kind of core aim is to achieve income equality, but if I'm also needing to live.
5 minutes, Simon.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, this is perfect because I'm wrapping up. So community organizations can at least play a corrective role in mediating the worst impacts of neoliberal economies, but can they be even placatory? So did we actually pacify the potential for more radical movements because people got involved in Makers Valley partnership initiatives with the hope of real change, and so maybe didn't get involved or start more radical initiatives? I'm not sure. We really were very open to and hoped for more organizations that were more activist leaning, and we didn't have them, but there is a possibility. And even the focus on well-being, for instance, the New Economics Foundation finds that it sometimes can distract from the underlying structural issues. So sometimes attempts to empower others may have the paradoxical effect of disempowering them. What I found, this is kind of the conclusion, is really important in this are critical partnerships. And these are partnerships like Makers Valley Partnership, or the organization that I'm working for now, EDP, really specializes in setting these up, where they strike a balance between an ethical congruency and transformative pragmatism. So learning and support networks like EDP specializes in can offer this possibility. Involvement of university and activist scholarship in those networks can help lend that critical eye and ensure that the ethics are maintained. It also, however, does rely on remaining ethical, relies on inner work to achieve that deep equity. And that's kind of an inquiry by those of us with power and privilege into how we've internalized this power and privilege, how our forms of openness and liberality and collaborating frequently can actually reproduce them. So the way that we remain liberal and open can actually reproduce the power. And also this inner work can support greater understandings of the systems that we as social entrepreneurs or action researchers or innovators can seek to change. So there were significant achievements, but and they were achieved through Makers Valley Partnership being a hybrid infrastructure, but it did rely on pragmatic compromises to that long-term vision. And critical partnerships are key. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Really quite interesting and provoking questions coming out of your work. I'd like to take the opportunity now to invite participants to drop their questions in the chat, and then we can go through them one by one. Maybe just, so you said you're just joining EDP. I'll just start. Since you're just starting EDP, when did your involvement with the Makers Valley program stop?
I'm still involved as board chair, so I'm still kind of involved from a conflict management, which this sometimes is, and fundraising perspective, but very much from a distance. Yeah. Also, if people want to come on, if they don't want to type, I'm open to people also coming on, asking the questions live if they want to. Yeah, so it was when I'm now based in Cape Town actually, and when I made that shift, I realized there was not going to be a chance to really be as hands-on as I used to be with Makers Valley Partnership, but it's now managed by a very capable CEO, Tobile Chittenden.
Okay, so one person has said, great to hear you speak about the MVP, Simon. I agree that once interest dies, the project does too. And the primary role of intermediaries, I think, has become resource mobilization. I wonder if you can share any challenges you experience with balancing grant making or resourcing responsibility and actual implementation as well, like with your COVID response projects, and whether this has influenced how MVP positions itself in future, if at all.
Any organization that receives donor funding or hopes to receive donor funding, in the end, and actually in my thesis, I wrote a little bit on this, and it's everyone who's involved in that space knows how much power that has on even defining one's of the organization's own focus and the projects that the organization's actually able to realize. Because although the intentions of an organization may be one thing, if there's no donor willing to put money to that, it's quite often not able to happen. So I think the how we tried to do it was continue with our own mission as much as possible through not being wholly dependent on grant, but not first having to find the money to do it. And in that way, we were able to remain relatively true to actual implementation actual activities. So and how that happened was, no matter how small something was, we would still try and run with it. So for instance, with edible streets, we just came together in the beginning and collected seeds, and literally did a seed dump on one of the pavement, didn't get permission from anybody. And that was pre-COVID when this became more common. And ended up having a flourishing garden. And it wasn't clear how long that would last. A lot of people were very suspicious that in that area, if you have vegetables or food on the side, that people would just sort of ransack the garden and the plants wouldn't have a chance to recuperate. But actually trying it out at that very small scale provided proof of concept. In the end, we did get funding from RMB and others to do a whole food forest on another pavement with fruit trees and other things. So I think that kind of start really small and trial it just with, if anybody has available time, that can really help to get the activity going, and then sometimes can actually lead to funding to scale up, or else there can be a revenue opportunity that arises along the way.
Okay, thanks for that. Our next question is, what would you do differently to have a greater impact given the opportunity? And do you think it'd be possible to do this in Cape Town?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the reasons why I was so excited about joining EDP is because it's like the daddy version of MVP, in a way. And I think that the core of it all is, or the mommy version, but the core of it all is that the partnerships were the key formulation that we relied upon to get any action done. That was the core of this infrastructure, the core of the intermediary, of the hybrid infrastructure. So I think what I would have done differently is, there's been a lot of tension along the way. A lot of people, and when I mentioned conflict resolution earlier, a lot of the tension has been because working with different organizations, that as partners, people inevitably feel that their toes are being stepped on, and there's this kind of subtle turf war that arises because as a partnership organization like MVP, we aren't often the people actually executing or implementing. It's our partners that are, and the other organizations, as much as we should have. So I think that's what I would do differently. Definitely lots of opportunity to do it in Cape Town. And we did see a lot of it around COVID with the cans. I wasn't involved in Cape Town at all, but the community action networks were an incredible opportunity to see that. EDP actually runs the food forum, which is continuing with a lot of that work. And I think—
Sorry, Simon, you just briefly froze there when you were telling us about what you would do differently. So if I could just ask you to repeat that so we can all hear.
Oh, sure. So just managing the conflict in a way that I think what happened was a lot of organizations felt that MVP had the potential to steal their limelight, to steal the spotlight from them when they were the ones executing, they were the ones actually carrying out the activities and doing the work. So I think sometimes we didn't always deal with that very well, in that we didn't celebrate our partners sufficiently and really kind of show that and really step back as MVP. I would say that that's something that we could continue to do better. And then, and definitely potential to continue it in Cape Town. I think that's why I've joined EDP, as I'm excited to try and do similar things here. There's already something called the Food Forum, which networks different organizations that started as cans and linked to the community action networks that started during COVID that EDP runs. So I'm excited to start seeing how that all works.
Thank you. Our next question is, do you think there's a potential to create a turnkey approach for scaling up this kind of project?
I think there's the opportunity to sort of have people that have done it in one. I mean, for instance, what arose during COVID-19 and then turned into People's Pantry, the people that were involved in that, I wasn't directly involved, but the people that were have supported similar initiatives in Hillbrow and other parts of the inner city and further afield. And the learning, that action learning or experiential learning that people encountered through setting up Makers Valley Partnerships initiatives is translatable to different contexts. I really don't have a whole lot of faith on the development of guidelines when our contexts are so different in South Africa, and sort of a blanket approach. I really think that it does rely so much on learning and support networks, where people are able to think creatively around how to translate with the people that originally implemented it, translate that into other settings. I think they're rough things that can happen, but often you get these guideline documents, but actually to implement in a different context, it's very difficult. So I'm not sure if there's a kind of turnkey approach. It depends how that turnkey approach is implemented, or if it's people-centric or sort of policy document or guideline-centric.
I think that's something that very often people who are anxious to solve some of these intractable problems look for, is a way to replicate success. And as you said, these things are very context dependent. I had a question while we're waiting, if you don't mind. Oh, did you want to respond?
No, I think I'm really excited about this learning and support network. Originally, when I came across the concept, I was thinking, oh my God, it's like just another talk shop, But I think if it's very action focused, I think that these sort of learning from each other opportunities, really, that is going to be where things scale. And, like somebody that you can have on speed dial to say, look, I've got this issue in your experience, what should I do with it? Rather than, just having a turnkey approach on paper.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested in that phrase that you used, hybrid infrastructures. My question for you is, in developing these new ways of working, do you necessarily see them as permanent arrangements, or are they necessarily dynamic, depending on the challenges that are faced? Like already this community had its own challenges, and then COVID came on top of it, creating a shock. So maybe if you could just speak to that a bit.
No, exactly. I think globally we are finding that this constant need for flexibility, it's extremely tiring, but essential given our increasing complexity and connectivity. And I think the same applied in experience here, where the core of the organization could possibly remain the same. So for instance, the nuts and bolts of having somebody that has institutional knowledge, that's a CEO, that's got experience, so somebody to support that person, somebody to manage the co-working space. So that very lean organization remained intact. And I think that that's essential to have continuity there, but then to embrace the complexity through being able to partner with various organizations, and that I think that kind of more nebulous aspect of hybrid infrastructure is it's not an infrastructure built in stone or whatever. It's really built in, I don't know, jelly. It's something that constantly needs to be shifting. And we found that, for instance, with COVID-19, we hadn't actually dealt at all with the food. Food was always an issue, but besides our edible streets gardens, we hadn't actually sort of done any kind of kitchens or otherwise. And then what arose was we kind of pieced together this puzzle using existing partners, but in a totally different configuration, where the people that were doing waste and dealt with separation of waste, and as a small enterprise, they took on board collection of recyclables from community members. In exchange, those community members were awarded points, which then became a kind of community currency. Those points were then they could spend them at a swap shop, which involved other partners that one of the people that had been involved in had been previously involved with, but then were able to, through the social network, bring them on board, which they supplied surplus food. And that surplus food was able to be bought with the points that people earned by bringing in recyclables. And then additional people came on board running kitchens that had been involved in Makers Value Partnership, but never run kitchens before, and then kind of partnered with those that had more experience there. So, and it all kind of relied on this pre-existing network, but that network was activated in a very different way because of the radically different context.
Thanks, Simon. We have just a little bit more time, so I'd like to invite attendees to pop their questions into the chat, and maybe just take the opportunity to say that if any of the participants would like to learn more about the Community Action Network that Simon referred to, we had a previous brown bag on that, and you can find it on our YouTube channel. Since I have the floor, I'll take the gap again. Can I ask you to elaborate a bit more on sort of the ethical challenges that you referred to, that you encountered in this process?
Yeah, so I think a lot of them had to do with the core concept of well-being economies, which is that people and planet, or in other words, social and ecological goals, have to or should be prioritized over the profit goal. And I think for myself and also for other organizations that run as social enterprises, it's sometimes difficult to know, like I mentioned earlier, how much money you should take as a salary, or how much what the difference in income should be for some of the so-called lower rung employees versus the higher rung employees. And I think there isn't really so should we all have a totally flat pay structure, for instance? And there isn't really a kind of blueprint for that, especially in South Africa, where inequality is so high and pay gaps are so high. So that was one thing I grappled with. And also in other organizations, I think quite often the rhetoric around the social enterprise obscures what's really happening. You know, the goals of, so when we were, for instance, running we were running a number of pitch competitions, and then awarded seed funding to winners. And where we kind of looked at the books and were able to see that that they weren't actually putting money towards their goals, but at the same time they were in startup phase, and we weren't sure whether to sort of hold that against them, or if it was something that would honestly come to the fore in future. But if they were being awarded funding based on the fact that they were a social enterprise and they weren't actually in the present working towards that vision of social change, and we're just sort of making money, was that something that would we have to hold that against them, and do we award the prize to them or not? And I think that was quite a complex thing to deal with. I think it would be helped. There's very interesting social economy green paper that was supposedly then becoming a white paper, and then now is back as a green paper. And it would be very helpful if there was more of an agreed upon definition of social enterprise, of a social economy, where we could actually sort of use that in our own businesses, and also when evaluating others.
But we really do appreciate the attendees who have stayed for the duration. And if you are interested in posing other questions to Simon, you can feel free to reference his address, simon@wcedp.coza, where you can correspond with him directly. And I'd like to say thank you, Simon, for opening our series for this year. This was really quite interesting. And please do stay in touch with us so we can learn more about how your learning support program unfolds. And I invite everyone to take a look at our social media channels, and our website, Bertha Centre at gsb.uct.ac.za to learn more about our work. Thanks very much, Simon.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for hosting so much. Great questions.
Okay, cool. Pleasure. Bye-bye, everybody.